That's what Lilith is doing in Isaiah 34. Her appearance in the ruins of Edom, alongside the owls and jackals and desert demons, tells the reader that God is done here. This place has been abandoned to the chaos realm. Now, think about what that is, and more importantly, what it isn't. Rather than being a story about a woman, or a story about creation, or the first wife or feminist revolt, or a battle over procreating positions, it's a single word that's in a judgment passage to communicate theologically about God's divine abandonment. And it's that word that got picked up, merged with the Mesopotamian demon tradition, attached to Genesis reading by medieval interpreters, elaborated into a full narrative in a joke text, developed further by Kabbalistic mystics, aestheticized by Roman poets, and eventually handed to pop culture as a feminist icon. All from Lilith. One word in a poem about ruins and God abandoning it. But there's still more to this story, because if Lilith barely appears in the Hebrew Bible, just in the book of Isaiah, where does the figure herself come from? Because surely it didn't just go from the owl demon to what it is now. Well, it came from Mesopotamia, specifically the ancient literature of Babylon and Assyria. So there are these things called the Akkadian texts. Akkadian being like the language of the ancient Babylon and Assyria, running roughly from about 2400 BC into the 1st centuries AD. They have a category of female demon called the LILITH, and the related to that is Ardat Lily. So these are wind demons. They're associated with disease and infant mortality, and with attacking people in their sleep. The LILITH specifically is dangerous, nocturnal, and connected to the liminal spaces between the human world and the supernatural one. She shows up in medical incantations and protective rituals, and in lists of demons that are needed to be warded off. The etymology of the name is debated. It probably comes from the Akkadian Lilu, meaning wind or storm, because Hebrew has Leilil, which means night. So the two etymologies kind of like got conflated, and then hence night demon. That stuck in the popular imagination and influenced how the Hebrew word Lilith got translated and understood. And there's also an older Sumerian text, part of the Gilgamesh cycle, called Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Underworld, that describes a figure living in the sacred Hulupu tree belonging to the goddess Inanna. So this figure was a long time identified as an early form of Lilith, which would have placed her in human awareness thousands of years before Isaiah. Most contemporary scholarship has walked that back significantly. The identification is based on uncertain translation work, and the figure may or may not be what earlier translators thought she was. But even in the Gilgamesh connection, even if that's weaker than originally thought, the broader Mesopotamian tradition of female wind demons is rather well documented. And then there's a second Mesopotamian figure who matters here because she explains something that the LILITH tradition alone cannot account for. Where did the baby killing thing come from? Well, the LILITH and the Ardat Lily are primarily sexual and illness demons. They're frustrated spirits of women who died young and unmarried, and they were targeting men. The whole killing infants and attacking pregnant women belongs to an entirely different figure, Lamashtu, who is like an Akkadian demoness who her entire domain was like destroying new life. Amulets against her are found across the ancient Near East, and so at some point, the LILITH tradition and the Lamashtu tradition began to fuse. Probably helped along by similar sounding names running, across this was like centuries of cultural transmission going on here. So that fusion is why the later Lilith mythology carries both functions at once. In the alphabet of Ben Sura, Lilith's two defining characteristics of being sexually deviant and murdering infants are very evident. They're the leftovers of two separate Mesopotamian demon traditions that had centuries to blend before anyone wrote them down as a single story. What all this means is that when Isaiah uses the word Lilith in chapter 34, he's drawing on imagery that his audience would have recognized from the surrounding culture. He doesn't need to explain who or what she is. She's a known figure. She's a demon of the wilderness, of the night, of the chaotic spaces outside of ordered human life. And her presence in a desolation oracle communicates exactly what he needs it to communicate. Lilith does not seem to have any special importance outside of Mesopotamia, really. She crossed the border once, in one verse, doing one specific theological job, and that essentially was like the extent of her biblical career. But there's also this famous Bernie relief. You've probably seen it because you're a very smart person. It's an ancient Babylonian clay plaque, because who hasn't seen this, dating roughly to 1800 BC, showing a winged nude woman standing on the backs of two lions surrounded by owls. For decades, it was identified as a depiction of Lilith and cited as visual evidence of how seriously the ancient world took her. It shows up in virtually every popular article about Lilith, usually with captions like, "Ancient depiction of Lilith." Most modern scholars no longer think that identification is correct. Current opinions lean towards, like I said before, Inanna, or possibly Oreshkigal, the goddess of the underworld. The Lilith identification is largely a modern interpretive tradition rather than the scholarly consensus. However, what is sort of a recurring theme in Lilith's story, the thing that people confidently point as evidence of Lilith, usually turns out to be Lilith at all. She's a bit like of the ancient Near Eastern Bigfoot of the world, constantly being spotted, but rarely people are able to confirm it. Also, one more last thing that's worth noting about this. For most of history that I've been describing, Lilith also isn't a singular named individual. It's also a category. The Lilu, Lilitu, and Ardet Lili are species of demons, not specific beings with personal biographies. The crystallization into a singular figure with her own story happens gradually, and we can actually track some of it. For example, a 7th century BC amulet found in Arslan Tash in what is now northern Syria, written in Phoenician, not Akkadian, shows the tradition migrating out of Mesopotamia into the culture before Isaiah wrote chapter 34. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, she appears by name in an exorcistic hymn, or a hymn of exorcism, singled out as a specific entity being invoked rather than a generic class. And by the Babylonian Talmud, which was compiled between roughly the 3rd and 7th centuries AD, she's fully embedded into everyday religious life. This world also warns that anyone who sleeps alone in a house will be seized by Lilith, because other passages connect her to abnormal births and describe her as a winged female demon with rather long hair. The physical evidence from the same period tells the same story in ceramic form. There's incantation bowls from this period that sometimes function as divorce papers, because a nocturnal emission was understood in this tradition as evidence that Lilith had visited you as a succubus, which constituted a kind of spiritual marriage. So you would commission a bowl with a formal bill of divorce. This is the deed of the divorce of Lilith. You are stripped, go out from the house and from the dwelling. So that's the world of the alphabet of Ben Sira, the world that it was written into. A world that had been actively warding off a specific named dangerous female demon for centuries, and that finally wanted to understand the backstory. Okay, so we have one word in Isaiah drawing on Mesopotamian demon tradition, filtered through a medieval reading of Genesis, elaborated into a full narrative in a satirical text from around the 8th century AD. That's the foundation. But the alphabet of Ben Sira is not the end of the Lilith story. It's more like the end of Act 1, because after Ben Sira, the Kabbalists pick her up. Kabbalah is the Jewish mystical tradition that developed seriously from around the 12th to 13th centuries onward. And its most important text is called the Zohar, compiled in 13th century Spain. In the Zohar, Lilith is significantly more developed and considerably darker than she is in the alphabet. She's no longer just a first wife who refused and fled. She's the consort of Samael, a demonic adversary figure in the Jewish tradition. She's the queen of demons. She becomes a cosmic force of impurity and chaos, constructed as the dark mirror of the Shekinah, which is a divine feminine presence of God in the world. Some later Kabbalistic texts distinguish between an older Lilith and a younger one. She has literally acquired an entire mythological biography at this point, built brick by brick on top of that one word in Isaiah. You cannot make this stuff up. But then comes the 19th century, and then Lilith enters Western literary tradition. She becomes a romantic figure of the dangerous feminine beauty, the seductive woman who exists outside of civilization's rules. And she becomes a staple of the occult and aesthetic movements that run through the 19th century. And then in the second half of the 20th century, something flips. The feminist reclamation begins. Scholars and writers like Judith Plaskow, being one of the most influential, take the Lilith narrative and read it as a parable of female resistance. The key text here is a 1972 thing written by Plaskow called The Coming of Lilith, which rewrites the story explicitly as a feminist allegory. Lilith magazine launches in 1976, identifying itself as an independent Jewish women's magazine and using Lilith as a symbol of the unapologetic woman who won't be contained. Sarah McLachlan's traveling music festival, the Lilith Fair, runs from 1997 to 1999. And by the early 2000s, the feminist Lilith is fully established into popular culture, and from there she migrates into fantasy, horror, television, games, and the broader internet mythology that most people encounter today. And what's striking about the feminist reclamation is that it requires a very particular reading of one of the source materials, one that takes the premise of the story and discards the consequence in order to get to the empowerment narrative. Kind of like what I alluded to before, the alphabet of Ben Sira is not a feminist text, it's a medieval joke explanation for protective infant amulets. And it's really interesting that each version of Lilith serves the need of the moment that produced her. Medieval rabbis needed to resolve an apparent tension in Genesis. Kabbalists needed a theological counterpart to the divine feminine that could carry the weight of demonic chaos. Victorian artists needed a beautiful woman for their paintings. And then second wave feminism needed an ancient precedent for women's resistance to the patriarchy. And pop culture needed a villain with good aesthetics and a decent backstory. But none of these Liliths are really the same figure. They're just different constructions, each one drawing on a previous layer of tradition, each one departing further and further away from the original single word in Isaiah, where kind of like this whole chain started. So with all that being said, let's pull back and look at what we actually have here. The Bible gives Lilith almost nothing. You get one word, Lilith, in one verse, Isaiah 34 verse 14, in a judgment about the ruins of Edom. She's not characterized, she's not named as a wife, she has no backstory in the text, no origin story, no dialogue, absolutely nothing. She appears appears in a list of creatures inhabiting ruins, and it's theological. A place populated by chaos creatures is a place that has been abandoned by the ordering presence of God. And that's actually a profound idea. The prophets had a whole theology of what happens when God withdraws himself. When a city or a nation has so thoroughly rejected divine order that God pretty much just hands it over to the chaos realm. That's kind of reminds me of Romans 1 a little bit. The desolation passages are making a claim about what the world looks like when it loses its ordering principle and when God takes his hand off. Lilith, in this context, is a symbol deployed in service of that claim. In that, the actual biblical theology of Isaiah 34 is almost entirely buried under 12 centuries of accumulated mythology. The story that everyone knows, like the story of that ends up on the magazine covers and the music festivals and names, essentially has nothing to do with the original story. And what I find most interesting is the process itself, because I think it tells us something important about how we read scripture. Because like, you take a Mesopotamian demon figure known from the surrounding culture, and then a prophet uses it or uses her once in a judgment poem. Medieval interpreters working from a separate question about, an apparent inconsistency in Genesis, independently develop a first wife narrative, and then that narrative gets written as a joke, and then the mystics turn it into a demonic woman figure, and then the romantics of the Victorian era use it in their paintings, and then the feminists reclaim it. Pop culture inherits the whole thing and just runs with it. So by the time Lilith shows up on Netflix, she's rather unrecognizable from the Lilith in Isaiah 34. She's carrying about 1,000 years of accumulated interpretation, with each layer and each brick previously, primarily to the previous layer rather than to the original source. And the result is that most people who know who Lilith is are not actually encountering anything ancient. They're encountering the most recent surface layer of a tradition that has been rebuilding her continuously since the medieval ages. And that's not uniquely a Lilith problem, however. That's how myths work. It's a good reminder that I heard that this is in the Bible, and this is actually in the Bible, are two claims that are always worth the effort of separating. Because sometimes what's between them is 1,000 years of very creative interpretations, and the thing at the bottom of the stack is something more interesting than any of the layers above it. So I hope you enjoyed this exploration of Lilith. If you did enjoy the video, please consider hitting the subscribe button, as it helps out my channel a lot. And yeah, that just Lilith, I guess.